Section 28. Issues with dual agency, customer or client, or no representation. That is the question. Dual agency is where confusion can start quickly. Dual agency is one of those topics that sounds simple until you are standing in front of a buyer at your own listing and they say, "We love it. Can you help us write the offer?" At that moment, you need to slow down. In Arizona, agency comes through the designated broker. That means if two agents under the same designated broker represent opposite sides of the same transaction, limited dual representation exists. It does not matter if the agents work in different offices, different cities, or have never met each other. The question is not whether the agents know each other. The question is, are they under the same designated broker? If the answer is yes, dual agency may exist and must be handled properly. Arizona does not use office agency or facilitators. Some states allow office agency or single agent agency. Arizona does not operate that way. Arizona follows the brokerage agency model. The designated broker is responsible for the brokerage, and agency flows through that broker. Arizona also does not allow licensees to simply act as neutral facilitators when preparing documents or being compensated in a transaction. If you are involved as a licensed real estate professional, your role must be clear. You represent the buyer, the seller, or both parties with proper written consent. This is why the question, "Who do you represent?" matters so much. When the listing agent represents the seller only, let's go back to the open house, you are the listing agent. Your seller has already told you they do not want dual agency, or your broker's policy does not allow you to act as a dual agent on your own listing. A buyer walks in, loves the home, and wants to write an offer. You can still work with that buyer, but you must make your role very clear. You represent the seller. The buyer is unrepresented. You may be honest and fair to the buyer. You may complete documents based on the buyer's instructions, if permitted by your broker. You may help with timelines, access for inspections, appraisal appointments, and walkthroughs. But you should not advise the buyer on price, strategy, terms, concessions, repairs, or negotiation against your seller. You work with the buyer. You work for the seller. That difference must be explained, documented, and repeated when necessary. Helping without representing. This can feel uncomfortable for newer agents because they want to be helpful. A buyer may ask, "Do you think the seller will fix the ceiling fan?" A careful response might be, "If you would like to request that repair, I can write it into your request exactly as you instruct me." You are not predicting what the seller will do. You are not coaching the buyer on strategy. You are helping document the buyer's instruction while still protecting your seller's interests. That is a delicate balance. Inspections, lenders, and timelines. If the buyer is unrepresented, they may still need practical help moving through the transaction. You may provide factual timelines. You may explain when the inspection period ends. You may give access for inspections, appraisals, and walkthroughs. You may provide a list of inspectors, lenders, or other vendors if your broker allows it. Be careful though. If you recommend one inspector and that inspector misses a major issue, the buyer may later say they relied on you. A safer practice is to provide several options and encourage the buyer to make their own independent decision. Again, the key is fairness without creating representation. When limited dual representation is allowed. If your broker permits limited dual representation and both parties agree, then the read and consent to limited representation must be handled before the offer is written. Both parties need to understand what limited representation means. You cannot tell the buyer the seller will accept less. You cannot tell the seller the buyer will pay more. You cannot disclose confidential motivation, price limits, repair flexibility, or negotiation strategy without written authorization. Dual agency is not impossible, but it must be handled with discipline. Compensation and the seller compensation addendum compensation must also be handled clearly. Seller payment of buyer-broker compensation is negotiable. It is not automatic and is no longer something agents should assume from the MLS. If the buyer wants the seller to pay buyer-broker compensation, that request should be documented through the proper written agreement or addendum, such as the seller compensation addendum when appropriate. The seller can accept, reject, or counter that request. If you are the listing agent and want to reduce or adjust your own compensation because you found the buyer, that should be discussed with the seller and documented properly, usually through a listing agreement addendum or broker-approved document. Do not make compensation assumptions. Put it in writing. Why facilitator language is risky. Sometimes an agent says, "I'm just helping both sides." That phrase may sound harmless, but in Arizona, it can create problems. If you are preparing documents, handling negotiations, or being compensated as a licensee, your agency role must be clear. Arizona does not treat facilitator as a safe middle ground for licensed agents in these transactions. You must know who you represent. You must document it. You must explain it. The big lesson: dual agency issues usually do not become problems because the agent intended to do something wrong. They become problems because the agent moved too fast. They started writing the offer before explaining agency. They tried to help the buyer without clarifying representation. They assumed compensation would work itself out. They treated dual agency like paperwork instead of a serious limitation on advocacy. Slow down. Explain your role. Follow your broker's policy. Use the correct forms. Document compensation. And when unsure, call your broker before moving forward. Broker tip: when working with an unrepresented buyer on your listing, repeat your role clearly. I represent the seller only. Say it early, document it in writing, and remind the buyer again before they sign documents. Clear repetition helps prevent implied agency claims. Why is dual agency determined by the designated broker in Arizona? Answer: Arizona follows the brokerage agency model. Agency flows through the designated broker. So if two agents under the same designated broker represent opposite sides, limited dual representation may exist. Question: what is the difference between working with an unrepresented buyer and representing that buyer? Answer: working with an unrepresented buyer may include providing factual information and completing documents based on instructions. Representing the buyer creates fiduciary duties and advocacy obligations. Question: why is the word facilitator risky in Arizona real estate transactions? Answer: Arizona licensees should clearly represent the buyer, seller, or both parties with proper consent. Acting as a neutral facilitator can create confusion about authority, duties, and compliance.